Let's take this same principle and apply it in a more tactical way. Any of you ever been in a negotiation where somebody made an ultimatum to you? Threw out an ultimatum, like, we'll never do this. You must do this. Yes? Yes. If you've lived, you've had an ultimatum thrown at you. My response, if somebody makes an ultimatum to me, to our side, if I'm in a negotiation, if I'm in a conflict, if I'm in a deal scenario, if it's a diplomatic situation, whatever, if the other side makes an ultimatum to us, I don't care if it's face-to-face, if it's an email, if it's a phone call, my response almost always is the same. If you're going to make an ultimatum to me, my response is going to be to simply ignore it. I'm not going to ask you to repeat what you said. I'm not going to ask you to explain what you said. I'm going to pretend it was never said and move on and address everything else you've touched on except the ultimatum. Now, why is that? A week from now, a month from now, a year from now, there may come a time when what you said you would never do, you realize you must do. Or what you said you would never do, you realize is actually in your interest to do. And when that day comes, the last thing I want you to remember is having said, I will never do this. Or the really last thing I want you to remember is me remembering you having said, you'll never do this. Because on that day, that will be the problem. It's the same principle. I'm thinking about how to write your victory speech for you on that day. I'm going to ignore your ultimatum so that I never force somebody to choose between doing what's smart and doing what makes them look good. To the extent possible, you want to align those two things. Now, you might ask legitimately, what if it's a real ultimatum and there you are ignoring it? Practically speaking, experientially, what I'll tell you is that's not a serious issue. And the reason is, if it's a real ultimatum, they really cannot do this. Don't worry. They're going to keep repeating that ultimatum over and over again through every channel, through the entirety of the negotiation. And at some point, you can decide, based on your understanding of the situation and where they've shown more and less flexibility and everything else you've learned in the process, that maybe this is a real red line for them. But it's also the case that often what comes across as an ultimatum isn't a real ultimatum. Sometimes people just feel like they've been pushed long enough, and they're trying to assert some control. Sometimes they're just trying to get some tactical advantage. I'll say I can never do it, and then they'll have to move. Sometimes, maybe cross-culturally especially, the language just gets used a little bit more strongly than it was intended or needed to be used. And for all those reasons, it's often better to just ignore it. Now, I will give you one variation on the theme. Sometimes, it is difficult to ignore what somebody said. If we're negotiating and the only thing you say to me is, I'm never going to do this, and that's all you said, and you're sitting right there, it's hard to ignore. Again, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. If I must engage with what somebody said, and it's an ultimatum, what I will often do, this is the variation on the theme, I will reframe it as a non-ultimatum before I move on. So if you say to me, I can never do this, I might say something like, listen, I understand given where things are today, this would be very hard for you to do. I get that. And what I'm doing is creating at least two outs. First, given where we are today, in other words, tomorrow or a year from now, we may not be where we are today. And secondly, this would be very hard for you to do, and I get that, rather than this is, of course, never going to happen, all right? And never in my experience has somebody stopped me at that point and said, no, 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 that's not what I said. I said never, ever, ever, ever. Usually they'll let it go and they understand, okay, point has been made, and now both sides have some outs, all right? Now,